I want to welcome people to the fourth session of Mishnah in Depth, Bava Metzia with Dr. Furst. This class is a project of Drisha's Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division and is sponsored in her memory by her family. This class is an accompaniment to Mishnah Yomit, to the Mishnah Yomit schedule for Bava Metzia, where we are assuming that you're doing some independent study of Mishnah on your own, and we will come together once a week to review, recap, elucidate, and more. We have had the pleasure for these past 4 weeks of learning with Dr. Rachel Furst. And so I want to hand things over to her. She is an accomplished educator teaching in both Israel and abroad, and we're always happy to have her back at Drisha.
Thank you very much for that introduction. So welcome back to everyone rejoining us for week 4. Guess it's a good opportunity to wish all a Shana Tova and a Gmar Chatima Tova. And it being today is October 6th, it's not the Hebrew anniversary of the beginning of this war, but it is the eve, I suppose, of October 7th, which is marked by many. So I wanted to dedicate today's learning in particular to all of those who lost their lives on October 7th and in all of the ongoing conflict since then, and in the merit of those who are still held hostage, and for the refuah shlema, the full healing of all those who have been hurt. Okay. Last week, we focused our study on chapter 2 of Masechet Bava Metzia, the mishnayot of chapter 2. Those of you who have been sticking with the Mishnah Yomit schedule will have by now finished chapter 3 and moved well through chapter 4 of the mishnayot. Chapters 1 and chapters 2, which we covered together in class, focused on the mitzvah of hashavat aveda, of returning lost items, and particularly what to do when items that have been lost become a point of conflict between those who find them, when one needs to declare the item missing, when one may acquire the item for oneself, etc. And today, I'd like to focus our collective learning on chapter 4. Now, I realize that means that we will not be discussing together the mishnayot of chapter 3, but have no fear, we will come back to them. In 3 weeks' time, we will get to the chapter which is known as Perek HaShoel, and that is a chapter that, much like chapter 3, sometimes known as Perek HaMafkid, deals with the laws of items that have been entrusted to different guardians, different types of shomrim, who have assumed responsibility for items that are not theirs, and the various limits and extensions of their responsibility for those items. So we will return to discuss the Mishnayot of chapter 3 when we get to that topic again. And at that juncture, perhaps we'll have an opportunity to discuss why Tractate Bava Metzia sort of separates these two chapters, does not juxtapose these two chapters, which very clearly deal with the same or a continuation of the same subject matter. But for today, as I said, we're going to be focusing on the Mishnayot of chapter 4. Again, those of you who are following along with the Mishnah Yomit schedule, today, Sunday, you will be studying Mishnayot 9 and 10 of chapter 4. And tomorrow you will be completing chapter 4 by studying Mishnayot 11 and 12. So I thought it was a good opportunity to really focus on that particular chapter. So without any further ado, I want to share my screen with you. Just bear with me for one moment. Okay. Yeah, that's good. Okay, great. And I want to start today. We discussed in our last class the significance or the value of looking at a complete chapter of Mishnah as one unit, sometimes helpful to look at it as a literary unit and to pay attention to the literary features. So I want to, before we begin to delve into some of the individual mishnayot of chapter 4 into some of the individual topics, I wanted to take a look together at the subject matter of the chapter as a whole. And I hope that this chart is helpful for doing so. So you'll see we have, again, as I just said, 12 mishnayot in this chapter. The first two focus on how to finalize a transaction involving movable property. The first one is some more general principles. The second Mishnah focuses on some examples of that. And we're going to take a look at those two Mishnayot together, so you'll have a better sense of what I mean in just a few moments. Then Mishnah 3 turns to a topic that accompanies us through most of this chapter, and that is the topic of ona'ah, or financial exploitation. Some might say fraud, financial fraud. Mishnah 3 focuses on the definition of ona'ah. Mishnah 4 questions who, in fact, is subject to the laws of ona'ah, or financial exploitation. Mishnah 5 focuses on a definition of ona'ah for coins in particular, keeping in mind, and we'll talk about this later as well, that coins in the time of Chazal were made out of actual metal, and the value of the coin was usually determined by the quantity of metal in that particular coin. Mishnah 6 examines the statute of limitations for ona'ah, right? Until when may someone retract or take back a financial transaction that they deemed to be exploitative? How long do they have to renege on the transaction because they determined that they were exploited, unfairly exploited? Mishnah 7 seems to digress briefly to list the minimum amounts of money needed to enact certain laws. Now, this Mishnah 7 begins with something that is related to ona'ah, but it then becomes a sort of list of things that don't seem to have very much to do with ona'ah at all, and that accompanies us into Mishnah 8, which lists 5 instances in which a person must add a fifth of the value of something. And that Mishnah really has nothing to do with ona'ah at all. But you'll notice that both Mishnah 7 and Mishnah 8, which seem to be digressions, are also lists. And this is actually fairly typical for the Mishnah, keeping in mind that the Mishnah, at least initially, was studied orally. Initially, it was not studied in written form. It probably wasn't written down at all. The Mishnah often employs mnemonic devices or memory aids to help people memorize these texts. And so oftentimes the Mishnah will use these listing devices. And so these lists, again, it's a little bit of a train of consciousness as far as the Mishnah is concerned, but these lists are therefore embedded in our chapter, again, because they touch off, or at least Mishnah 7 touches off with something that is pertinent to the subject of ona'ah. But in Mishnah 9, we're still listing, but we return to the subject of ona'ah. Mishnah 9 provides us with yet another list of 9 things to which the laws of ona'ah do not apply. Mishnah 10 takes the subject of ona'ah to another level by talking about not financial exploitation, which has been the primary definition of ona'ah up until this point and in discussions of the rabbis in general. But Mishnah 10 talks about another form of ona'ah, which it calls ona'at divarim, which I think we can translate as either verbal exploitation or verbal oppression. And we'll take a look at that Mishnah together to get a better sense of what the rabbis meant by that. And finally, to round out the chapter, we have Mishnayot 11 and 12, which are not exactly about ona'ah anymore, but they are about other exploitative or forbidden, therefore forbidden business practices. The prohibition to mix produce from different fields or wine from different presses, lest they be of differing values, but charged at the higher rate. And again, Mishnah 12 goes on to talk about other forbidden business practices as well. So this is a basic overview, at least topically, of the main subjects covered in our chapter. What I'd like to do with our time together today is to delve into a couple of these mishnayot in a little bit more depth. And I want to start with Mishnah number 1. We said that Mishnah number 1 is about, again, flipping back here for 1 second, is about how to finalize a transaction involving movable property. And the Mishnah here seems to jump right in, or seems to even begin sort of mid-sentence or mid-thought. The Mishnah says, "Zahav kone et hakesef, ve'hakesef eino kone et hazahav." Right? When one party takes possession of gold coins, the other party acquires silver coins. Now, we're obviously talking about two people who are engaged in a business transaction. One of the people has gold coins and wants to trade them for silver coins. Now, in order to understand the Mishnah's ruling here, it's important to keep in mind that in the time of the rabbis, standard coins were made out of silver. The majority of coins were made out of silver. But there were also other coins that were made of other metals like gold and, as we're about to see, copper. Now, the general rule is that in order to acquire an item, a person, the buyer, the purchaser, the person, the acquirer, has to do an action that demonstrates ownership over the item they wish to acquire. That's a general rule according to Talmudic law. As a matter of fact, we saw this already a little bit in chapter 1 of Bava Metzia, where we were talking about the two people who were holding onto a talit that they found, a garment that they found, each of them claiming to have acquired the entire garment. Now, their claim was based on the fact that they were physically holding the item, right? So generally speaking, physically holding an item, raising an item, or sometimes pulling an item is the way that a person demonstrates control over that item and thereby ownership. Paying for something, right, that is transferring money to someone else does not, according to Talmudic law, affect acquisition, right? That does not prove, or that does not make the acquisition final. It does not make the transaction final. That's the understanding that we're working with in this Mishnah. That's the background to this particular Mishnah. And I'm going to apologize. I just want to close the window for a moment. Okay, excuse me about that. So that, with that in mind, what our Mishnah seems to assume here is that if two people are trading coins, right, they're conducting this exchange of coins, one of the types of coins is in fact considered or understood to be money, whereas the other type of coin is really more like a movable piece of property. Right. And since I said just a moment ago that in the time of Chazal, the standard coins were silver, the silver coins here are understood to be money, whereas the gold coins for which they're being exchanged are actually understood to be movable property as opposed to money. Right. And so therefore, that's the logic that the Mishnah is working with when it teaches that if one party takes possession of gold coins and the other party acquires silver coins, right, that works, right? As soon as the party lifts or drags or grabs onto the gold coins, again, the gold coins are the movable piece of property. They're not considered money in this instance. that action affects the sale, right? That action finalizes the transaction. And therefore, the person who acquires the silver coins has now come into possession, has come into ownership of the silver coins. However, it doesn't work the other way around. If the first person takes possession of the silver coins, right? The silver coins are the money. Taking money doesn't finalize the transaction, and therefore, just by virtue of the fact that one party physically took the silver coins, that does not automatically mean that the other party thereby came into possession of the gold coins. Right? Does that make sense? I hope that was a clear explanation, right? It's confusing because we're talking about two piles of coins or two bunches of coins here. But the difference is that one of these bunches of coins is considered movable property, right? And the Mishnah goes on to apply that principle to other types of coins that aren't in fact considered money, like copper coins as compared to the silver coins, because again, copper coins were not standard money in those days. Similarly, flawed coins, right, which could not be used as money, etc. And the Mishnah concludes down at the bottom by saying, this is the principle, zeh haklal, with regards to those who exchange all forms of movable property. Each acquires the property of the other, right? In other words, if people are exchanging two types of movable property, then it doesn't really matter who picked up the property first. As soon as one person picked up the new property, then the transaction was finalized, right? And that's the difference. The point that the Mishnah is trying to make here is that movable property can be acquired by taking control of it, by bringing it into your physical possession, whereas just acquiring money does not finalize the transaction, right? Which is a little bit, again, it might not be precisely the way that we would think about it intuitively today, but that was the way that Chazal understood acquisition. And that's the subject of this particular Mishnah. To make that a little bit, yes, is there a question?
Yeah, do we know if they used bartering more than coins, or we have no idea what was more prevalent?
Well, so bartering was definitely still, I mean, as per this Mishnah, bartering was still definitely a common mode of a financial transaction. But definitely by the time of Chazal, by the time of the Mishnah, there was a concept of money being used to purchase things. And so again, the point here is not that the rabbis were opposed to buying things with money. It's just the question is, technically speaking, when does the financial transaction, when is it affected? When does it become finalized? Right? And we're going to see that that has implications for, can you take it back, right? If you gave somebody money for something, can you change your mind, right? If you bartered with somebody and you both exchanged movable pieces of property, then you can't take it back. I mean, unless the other person agrees, right? Obviously. But neither of the two parties who have exchanged movable property, two parties exchange movable properties, each of them lifts the property, thereby bringing it into their own possession. That's a done deal, right? Nobody can back out of it at that point. On the other hand, right, if they were instead of exchanging goods, exchanging movable property, one person was giving money for an item, just transferring the money doesn't finalize the deal.
No, I was curious what was more prevalent.
Yeah, okay. I can't tell you exactly what was more prevalent, but I can tell you that certainly it was very common to acquire property with money by that particular point.
Thank you.
Okay. So, and I just want to make this point about how things were acquired a little bit clearer by referring to a Mishnah, not from our tractate, but from Tractate Bava Batra, which actually discusses, as you can see here, several methods of acquiring movable property. So for example, the Mishnah here talks about one is hamocher perot lechavero, right? Someone who sells fruit to their fellow, right? And here again, we can kind of assume that the selling is referring to, the person paid with money, right? It's being sold in the same way that we would refer to being sold. But the question is again, how is that transaction affected from a halachic vantage point? And the Mishnah in Bava Batra says, with regards to one who sells produce to another, if the buyer pulled the produce, right? This is called mishicha in halachic parlance, but did not measure it, he has acquired the produce through the act of acquisition of pulling, right? So pulling something, pulling a piece of movable property can affect the kinyan, the acquisition. On the other hand, if he measured the produce but did not pull it, he has not acquired it. And either the seller or the buyer can decide to rescind the sale. That's the implication, as we just said. Right? The Mishnah goes on to discuss all kinds of other ways of, depending on the particular type of movable object, things can be acquired. But the point is, as I said beforehand, that from the halachic perspective, some kind of physical act that demonstrates ownership, that demonstrates control of this piece of property is necessary in order to effect the acquisition. Okay, that was Mishnah 1 of our chapter. Mishnah 2, as we said just a moment ago, continues on the same theme, asking how so? Right? Give me some examples, right? What are the implications of this rule that we just learned? Well, so for example, if the buyer pulled produce, again, we're talking about, right, mishicha, right, demonstrated ownership by pulling or moving the produce from its position, but the buyer, right, this buyer has pulled the produce, but has not yet given the seller their value in money. Has the transition been affected? Well, yeah, because we just said that an act of mishicha constitutes a kinyan. And so therefore, at that point, he cannot renege on the transaction. On the other hand, if the buyer gave the seller money but did not yet pull the produce, didn't perform that action of kinyan, at that act of kinyan, then he can renege on the transaction as the transaction is not yet complete. That's certainly, technically speaking, the way that it goes. Okay, so that's the basic rule that the Mishnah lays out. However, right, even if technically you can renege or you can retract the transaction after you've given the money, but before you've taken the item into your possession, it's not exactly good practice according to the rabbis, right? It might be technically permissible, but not encouraged. And so the Mishnah goes on to teach that with regards to the latter case, meaning the case where you've given money, not yet acquired the item, and then reneged on the whole transaction, the sages said, he who exacted payment from the people of the generation of the flood and from the generation of the dispersion, right, the Dor HaMabul and Dor HaFlaga, will in the future exact payment from whomever does not stand by his statement, right? Hu atid lihifara mimi she'ino omed b'diburo, right? In other words, God does not look very favorably, right? And think about what do the people of the flood generation and the people of the Tower of Babel generation, what do they represent? Why are they being mentioned here?
They
Any ideas?
stole and they didn't
Okay.
have fear of
So
God.
they were famously, right, they were thieves, right? And so these people, they were engaged in Hamas, right, in violence and thievery and thuggery, right? These are the sins for which the Mabul and subsequently was brought upon them, and subsequently the Tower of Babel, right? They were dispersed, right? And so in a sense, the Mishnah here is comparing someone who reneges on a transaction after he has paid the money to the people of these infamous generations. Yeah. And God will punish that person much as God punished the people of Dor HaMabul and Dor HaFlaga. Now, interestingly, what the Mishnah says here, and this is a sort of, you might be wondering what this is even doing in the Mishnah, since it's a kind of, it sounds more like a midrash than like a law. But interestingly, the Mishnah says that God is going to exact punishment, divine punishment, right? In other words, the point is, right, that God punished those people, and so too is divine punishment going to be enacted on this person who reneges on the transaction, even though an earthly court, a human court, will not punish him or her. But why do you think the Mishnah says, Mimi she'eino omed b'diburo, that God is going to exact punishment or payment on one who does not stand by his statement? Are we talking about a statement here? Right? What happens? A person gave money and then broke the transaction, broke the deal. Right? In other words, demanded the money back, said, I don't want to go through with it.
Well, maybe it's like he had a contract. He said, I would do this. I made a deal with you. They agreed on a certain amount of money for the transaction. And
Okay,
now
so what I
he's
think,
saying no.
yeah, so what I think you're suggesting is that the Mishnah seems to be implying here that paying money for something is a sort of, it's a social code, we might call it, for a contract, right? For your word, for your intention, for an agreement that you made with this other person to actually go through with the transaction, to go through with the deal. And so even though what the Mishnah has described technically as happening is that you paid money for something and then you decided to renege on the transaction, it's not that you just, gave your word and then went back on your word. Effectively, the Mishnah is implying by giving money, you have indicated, right? That's the way our social code works. When you pay for something, even though halacha might not recognize technically paying the money as a finalizing of the transaction, nevertheless, people, right? The person to whom you gave the money certainly assumes that if you're handing over the coins, if you're handing over the money, you have every intention of completing the purchase. You have every intention of completing the transaction. And so if you renege on the deal after you've given the money, you're effectively reneging on your word, right? That was the clearest, it was an action, giving the money, but it was the clearest indication of your word, of your intention, and probably of actual spoken words that were traded between these two people. Okay, I want now to move. Yes, if there's a question, please go ahead.
Yes. I'm just relaying this from Yasmin, who's having some mic problems. She asked regarding to earlier in this Mishnah, quote, I was going to ask if pulling was the thing that caused kinyan in all cases, whether money was exchanged or not. And it seems like the pulling, the possessing the object is the main thing. Sort of like how you have to hand someone a get. It has to change hands. Yasmin, did I get that right?
Yes, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah,
yes, we can hear you now, loud and clear.
Whoa.
Okay, great. So that's a good question. Yes, meaning mishicha or pulling is the mode of acquisition that our Mishnah refers to, and it is one of the primary modes of acquiring movable property. There are other options, like for example, lifting something, right? Lifting something is another way, or sometimes the required way of acquiring movable property. With regards to an animal, which is a form of movable property, there's causing the animal to move, even if you don't physically pull the animal, right? But you call the animal to you, causing the animal to physically move. And again, I'm going to remind you of some of the mishnayot that we saw in chapter 1, which made reference to these rules as well. That's also a means of acquiring it. The idea is that it has to be some form of action that demonstrates you as the new owner taking control over the property, right? That from a halachic vantage point is the standard way of acquiring a piece of movable property, right? As opposed to, again, just giving the money is not sufficient as far as halacha is concerned. I hope that answers the question. Okay, now I want to go back just for a moment to our list, right? So we've now moved through Mishnah 1 and Mishnah 2, and as I pointed out earlier, the remainder of the chapter more or less deals with financial exploitation or ona'ah and various other, a couple of asides, as we said, and various other business prohibitions. And so what I'd like to do now, before we get to the mishnayot themselves, excuse me, I just lost my place here. What I'd like to do before we get to the Mishnah itself is to take a step back for a moment and to look at the Torah source for this whole concept of ona'ah, or financial oppression, financial exploitation. And the source for this is, in fact, the verses in Leviticus. This is Parashat Behar, which appear in the context of the Torah talking about the mitzvah of Yovel, the Jubilee year. And one of the things that the Torah says is that in the Jubilee year, which was the 50th year, or after 7 Shemitah cycles had passed, land that had been purchased reverted back to its original owner. In other words, the Torah conceives of a system whereby you don't ever purchase land for eternity. You're really actually only kind of leasing the land that you might buy, the real estate that you might buy, until the end of the Yovel cycle, at which point it will all revert back to its original owners. Now, in that context, in the context of discussing Yovel and some of those rules, the Torah says, "V'chi timkeru mimkar amitecha ukone miyad amitecha, al tonu ish et achiv." When you sell property to your neighbor or buy any from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. And I want to point out here that the Hebrew al tonu, that is uses the same root as the word ona'ah, right? Not wrong one another or exploit one another. In buying from your neighbor, you shall deduct only for the number of years since the Jubilee. And in selling to you, that person shall charge you only for the remaining crop years, right? Knowing that land you're selling or buying is really only being leased for the number of years that remain until the next Jubilee comes along and everything reverts back, right? You have to take that into consideration in terms of setting the price when buying or selling the land. Not doing that, the Torah seems to be saying, is wronging one another, right? That is a form of exploitation, not adjusting the price in accordance with this reality that you all know to be the case. The more, in verse number 16, the more such years, the higher the price you pay, the fewer such years, the lower your price. For what is being sold to you is in fact a number of harvests, right? It's a number of years worth of using the land. And the Torah concludes, "V'lo tonu ish et amito, v'yareta me'elokecha ki ani Hashem elokechem." Do not wrong one another, but fear your God, for I, Hashem, am your God. Okay, so we see this word tonu appears twice in verse 14 and in verse 17. And this is the basic Torah source for the concept of financial exploitation, of wronging a fellow financially. Now, I want to point out that in the Torah, right, it's very obvious by this point that the whole concept of ona'ah, of financial exploitation, is first and foremost about what kind of property, of mischarging or overcharging someone for what kind of property. Yes, Evelyn?
Yeah, so it seems to be that what the Torah is asking of people is to deal in an equitable fashion in a sale. But in some of the mishnayot that we are doing, it limits that thing, that idea, based on whether the buyer comes to complain or not. And it also limits it in term, I mean, you have that passage where, I forget which rabbi it is, but it was the merchants of Lud, I think. And he says he changes the equation and then they're happier. So it acknowledges the fact that there was a degree of exploitation.
Yeah.
So it's not as if it was part of the whole dealing and
Yeah.
wheeling, and it was
Yeah.
accepted. So, you know, as opposed to this, where the Torah says it's totally not accepted. It seems to be
Yeah.
that there
So
are many situations where it is, you know, it's, you know, you get away with it.
Okay, so that's a good point. Certainly, as you say, and we're going to take a look at that Mishnah with the merchants of Lod in just one moment, right? The Mishnah seems to recognize that people do engage in financial forms of financial exploitation, despite the fact that the Torah seems very clearly to prohibit the practice. What I also want to underscore is that the Torah seems to be talking about ona'ah as being, right, the prime example that they bring of financial exploitation has to do with land, right? This is all about land, which should therefore surprise us to discover that in the mishnayot, that is in the rabbinic system, the concept of ona'ah, financial exploitation, seems to be not about land at all, right? Evelyn just referred to Mishnah 3 of our chapter, right, which is the beginning of the discussion of ona'ah in this chapter, where, exactly as you said, the rabbis establish exactly what amount of overcharging, what percentage of overcharging is considered exploitative, is considered ona'ah. And again, here they're clearly talking about money, about movables. That becomes very clear in several of the following mishnayot. And finally, we get to Mishnah 9 of the chapter, which says very, very explicitly, these are matters that are not subject to the halachot of exploitation. And what does the Mishnah list here? Slaves and documents and land and consecrated property. Right, so land appears here in a list of the prime things that are not subject to the laws of ona'ah. Now, why are these particular things not subject to the laws of ona'ah? And the Mishnah also says they're also not subject to the payment of double the principal or 4 and 5 times, right? Why are these things ostensibly not subject to the laws of financial exploitation? Well, the basic answer that the Mishnah provides is that these objects, right, something can be subject to the laws of exploitation when it is very clear, when there's a very clear way of defining what is overcharging, right? Overcharging, or by the way, overcharging from the perspective of the seller or underpaying from the perspective of the buyer. Right, to either overcharge or underpay when there's a very clear market value for something, that's called ona'ah. But the Mishnah goes on to say that these slaves, documents, land, consecrated property, and various additional items that we'll speak about in just a minute, these things don't have a very fixed price. And once they don't have a very fixed price, then they can't really be subject to the laws of ona'ah because it's not, it's difficult to define what actually constitutes exploitation. Now, how could it be, right? It should strike us as a bit odd that the Torah presented the whole concept of exploitation in the context of talking of land. And for the Mishnah, for the rabbis of the Mishnah, land is one of the prime examples of something that is not subject to exploitation. So any suggestions as to how that transition might have occurred? How is it that the rabbis refer to land as something not subject to ona'ah when that seems to be the Torah's prime example? I hope that question was clear. Well, one thing that I want to suggest, one possibility is that the way of thinking about land, the value of land, may actually have changed from the time of the Torah until the time of the Mishnah. Right? In the time of the Torah, land, again, and if we're thinking about in a system of yovlot, where land reverts within a particular set of a number of years, the land is going to revert to its original owner. Land was something which perhaps in the time of the Torah did have a more obvious and fixed value, right? The Torah talks about calculating according to the number of harvests and whatnot. By the time the rabbis were discussing the laws of ona'ah, it's very possible that the whole attitude towards land shifted. And movable property became something that had more of an obvious, fixed, clear value. And land, well, the system of Yovlot was not in place anymore. Land can be used for different purposes. It can mean different things to different people. As we know, different real estate can be prime real estate or less desirable real estate, and therefore its value will fluctuate. And so the whole concept of the Torah's concept of land as something having fixed value and therefore being subject to onah simply changed in terms of the reality by the time of Chazal. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that when the Torah talks about ona'ah in the context of land and yovel, the Torah is really just giving a sort of general principle. It's talking about the value, about the ethics of not wronging your fellow financially, but really just, using land as an example of such. And Chazal, their ruling was a bit of a drasha. It might have taken the verses out of their initial context, but they were really focusing in on the nitty-gritty, much as we have seen in other cases, where again the Torah is seems to be more values oriented, and Chazal are focusing more on the particulars, and therefore they applied that in a more specific way. I want to take a look again, as we said just a moment ago.
Just had one question.
Yes,
is there a
please.
difference in when you're analyzing these texts in terms of the land issue? Is there a difference between land in Eretz Yisrael and land Michutz La'aretz?
So again, the Torah is clearly talking about land in Eretz Yisrael because it's talking about the whole system of Yovlot,
Right.
which only applies in the lands of Israel. When Chazal are talking about land here, they are not talking about land that's exclusive to the lands of Israel, right? They're talking about real estate, meaning landed property, as opposed to movable property.
That could
So
be
again, their
explained
whole
as
concept of land,
different.
right? Their whole relation to land is very different than the Torah's concept of land. But I did want to just highlight to point out that distinction exists between the Torah and Chazal. And again, this is something that we keep seeing consistently, that the rabbis' understanding of these laws, or their the spelling out of the details of these laws, sometimes does diverge from the original biblical context in which they appear, even though, again, as we said, in Bava Metzia, most of the laws are derived from a biblical source.
Is it also possible that they discuss land because that was the most sought after and valuable commodity in those days?
In the Torah times, yes.
Yeah.
That was the primary, again, the Torah was envisioning a landed society, right? A society in which people owned land and were primarily agriculturally oriented and based. The Torah, again, might therefore have referred to land not to the exclusion of anything else, but just because that was its basic concept of property, was land.
Right.
Again, keep in mind the Torah is talking about, when the Torah talks about ona'ah or oppression in the context of, again, sort of exploiting someone by selling them land that is going to revert back to you for more than the value of the harvests that they have left to actually work that land. The Torah is talking about relations between, people who are powerful in society, people who are weaker in society, right, based on their land ownership. And so it's possible that the rabbis understood the Torah to be just talking about, again, in sort of broad principled ideas, using the commodities that the Torah had, that made sense in the society of that day. Whereas for the rabbis already, again, their society was based on very different relationship to land, different relationship to movable commodities, and so they translated it in slightly different ways. Yes.
And they were some of them were outside of Israel, and this didn't apply anymore.
Well, certainly, I mean, the whole system of Yovlot was no longer in practice.
Right.
Definitely. Yes. The whole Torah system of Yovlot was no longer in practice for the rabbis. And so when they're translating what the Torah has to say about Yovel, the Yovel system, into principles that are more broadly applicable,
Right.
again, they certainly expanded out beyond land. What's particularly striking, that's kind of par for the course, typical. What's striking in this case is that they negate the application of the ona'ah concept to land. And that's striking just because for the Torah, that's the prime example.
Yes. I just want more idea. I think wasn't the idea in order to make sure that the inequalities were sort of every 50 years, the distribution of wealth was realigned?
Yes, that was the idea. Yeah. And that was considered to be, that was a way of keeping recalibrating society, of keeping, of minimizing the gap between the rich and the poor, that everything was recalibrated every 50 years. Yeah.
Right. So what any of these
right on the assumption again that people didn't want to sell their property, they might have been compelled to sell their property by their financial straits, but no property sale was really final because ultimately it would come back to them.
So do any of these laws try to do that also?
Do any of the laws of ona'ah, are they about, well, they are, this is a good question. I'll have to think about that. I'll have to think about that for a moment now, and
okay,
a little bit more after the class. But definitely, right, this idea, again, the idea that ona'ah, that exploitation is about taking unfair advantage of somebody. Again, the relationship between, powerful and weak, the one who's selling, the one who's buying, and thinking of, keeping in mind who is coming to the transaction with, more power because of the information that they have, because of the money that they have. Right. Again, we referred to a Mishnah that talks about sort of creating a statute of limitations, but giving people a window of opportunity to contest an exploitative transaction. Those are all principles that the rabbis conceived of as a means of trying to level the playing field, I think, perhaps in a way that is similar, at least in concept, to what they believe the Torah had in mind with regards to the whole Yovel system. As a matter of fact, maybe this is a good opportunity. Two things. I just want to say in brackets that here in the Mishnah that we're looking at, that's on the screen at the moment, which is Mishnah number 9, excuse me. I want to point out that at the very end of this Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda says that even in the case of one who sells a Torah scroll, an animal, or a pearl, right, which are all obviously movable properties, those specific forms of movable property are not subject to the halachot of exploitation of ona'ah, because they don't have presumably because they do not have a fixed price, right? So in other words, ona'ah, and again, in this very strictly defined way that the rabbis understood it, is not applicable to things where the price fluctuates. Now, why? And again, the rabbis said to him, right, the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, and they say, no, in fact, the early sages meant only those items listed above: slaves, documents, lands, consecrated property. They didn't mean this additional list. Rabbi Yehuda is trying to apply what he believes to be the principle behind the rabbis' original list of slaves, documents, lands, and consecrated property to other items that he, in his day, felt did not have a fixed price. And I just want to take a very quick look here. Excuse me. Let's see if I can I got a little bit out of order here, and just one moment. I want to take a very quick look, at this Tosefta. The Tosefta, again, is a parallel sort of collection to the Mishnah. And here, Rabbi Yehuda in the Tosefta says, again, a Torah scroll, an animal, or pearl, this is a parallel to the Mishnah that we just saw. They are not subject to claim of fraud or exploitation. Why? And the Tosefta provides a logic. A Torah scroll, because it is beyond price. A beast or an animal or a pearl, because a person wants to buy them for a match with their counterpart, right? Maybe because he wants to thresh with two animals together, or because wants to make a pair of earrings, let's say, with two pearls. And so therefore there's no fixed value. There's no limit to what they would be willing to pay. The rabbis, according to the Tosefta, said to Rabbi Yehuda, but it is not so that every sort of object a man might want to match with its pair, right? So then if that's the idea, then anything could fit into that category and therefore be exempt from the laws of exploitation. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says a horse, a battle axe, and a good sword in a time of war are not subject to a claim of fraud. I thought that struck me as sort of particularly poignant in our current, I'm sitting here in Zichron Yaakov in Israel, where we've had a bunch of sirens recently, is particularly poignant at this moment, that certain items based on the circumstance become valueless, right? In other words, people will be willing to pay well beyond what anybody might imagine is the market value for certain things because they're necessary for self-defense, because they're necessary for any one of another, for preservation of life, which is something that we don't place a value on. So I just wanted to point to that Tosefta in order to explain our Mishnah. But now I'd like to go back. Someone mentioned beforehand, I believe Evelyn mentioned the story with Rabbi Tarfon and the merchants of Lod. And I want to take a quick look, I want to take a quick look at that, which is back here in Mishnah 3 that we began to examine. This is again the Mishnah which tries to define monetarily what constitutes exploitation. And the Mishnah says pretty clearly that something is considered financial exploitation or ona'ah when you charge somebody more than a sixth above its market value. Right? If you charge more than a sixth, right, there's a certain amount of leeway that merchants have to set the price of their wares. But if they charge more than a sixth of the market value, that's considered ona'ah. Now, the rabbis also, the Mishnah also sets, as we said, a sort of time limit. Until when is it permitted for the buyer to return the item, right? And so the Mishnah here assumes that if you, the buyer, have been subject to financial exploitation, you will have the option of canceling the transaction, right? Ona'ah is prohibited, and one of the implications is that you can just cancel the transaction if it turns out that you have been exploited in this way. But you can do so within a very fixed period. And the Mishnah says the buyer, the purchaser who has been exploited, may return it only until a period of time has passed that would allow him to show the merchandise to a merchant or to his relative who might be more familiar with the value of that merchandise and can say to him, no, you've been swindled, right? You've been taken advantage of, go give that back, right? So you have a certain small, I don't know, maybe this is an hour or 2 hours, right? A certain small window of time during which you can go and check out whether you made a good transaction. If not, you can go and cancel the transaction. Beyond that point in time, you have lost your option for doing so. Now, the Mishnah continues. I'm now in the middle of this passage. That Rabbi Tarfon, who was one of the sages in Lod, ruled in Lod, exploitation is in fact a measure of 8 silver ma'ah from the 24 silver ma'ah of a selah, meaning 1/3 of the transaction. So Rabbi Tarfon said, no. He said, actually, right, ona'ah is only if someone overcharges by more than 1/3, right? The rabbis had said, ona'ah is when someone overcharges by more than 1/6. He said, no, it's more than 1/3. And the merchants of Lod rejoiced. right? Obviously, right? That gave them a much greater margin for overcharging their customers and not running afoul of the laws of ona'ah. But then Rabbi Tarfon said to them, but along with the greater margin for ona'ah, I also rule that throughout the entire day, it is permitted to renege on the transaction. And not only for the amount of time that it would take somebody to run and show their purchase to a relative or to a professional. In other words, you get a little bit more leeway on overcharging, but the buyer also has a lot more leeway for checking out and then possibly canceling the transaction. At which point in time, according to the story, the merchants of Lod said to him, meaning Rabbi Tarfon, oh, forget it. Let's go back to the way things were. Let Rabbi Tarfon leave as we were, right? Yaniach lanu Rabbi Tarfon bimkomenu v'chazru l'divrei chachamim. And they reverted to the statement of the rabbis. They said, you know what? We'd much rather go with the original ruling of the rabbis. We'll stick to the ona'ah, the definition of ona'ah as being anything above 1/6, overcharging by anything more than 1/6. But we'll also stick to that very small window of opportunity for the purchaser to check it out and then renege on their transaction, right? Now, there's something strange about this story. The story is curious for many reasons, and I'll just say this in brief since our time is almost up. First of all, it's just a little strange, this type of interaction that the merchants of Lod are having with Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon was one of the great sages. If Rabbi Tarfon issued a ruling, I mean, what is this? You know, it seems like a negotiation that he's having with the merchants of Lod. That seems a little bit bizarre in terms of the relationship of one of the rabbinic rulers, the great rabbinic figures, with these merchants. But also, we can understand why the merchants of Lod would have liked that larger window, that larger sort of leeway for overcharging up to 1/3. But it's hard to imagine that Rabbi Tarfon really think that it was permissible to overcharge by up to 1/3 of the value of the merchandise? Right? Could he have actually thought that was an acceptable, a real definition of ona'ah? And so here I just want to very briefly refer, and I'm happy to actually send anybody this article, to an article by Rabbi Avi Wolfish, who I mentioned in previous sessions, who reads this Mishnah, reads this story, I should say, as a sort of interaction, who questions what Rabbi Tarfon's motive was, and suggests that in fact Rabbi Tarfon didn't really intend to change the definition of ona'ah, but that his interaction with the merchants here was meant to achieve its ultimate result. That is, it was meant to get the merchants to embrace the original ruling that ona'ah is anything above 1/6 beyond the market value, charging anybody above 1/6 of the market value of a particular item. He meant to sort of steer them in the direction of embracing that halacha, and also perhaps to expose, as someone mentioned earlier, the fact that these merchants weren't acting in such good faith. They probably were overcharging their customers all the time. And again, as was mentioned beforehand, there's something that's a little bit troubling about that, but there's something that's quite interesting, and perhaps we can discuss this further on other occasions, about this kind of what this story suggests about the relationship between halachic authority and the population that they serve, and how halachic authority, the tools that halachic authorities might use to inspire a population, to move a population in the direction that they see as being halachically ideal. Since our time is over, we're not going to look at any more mishnayot together, but I do, before we conclude, just want to point to one very, very last Mishnah, and that is Mishnah number 10 of this chapter. And Mishnah number 10, as we said before, talks about a different form of ona'ah, not ona'at mammon, not exploiting someone financially, but exploiting someone or oppressing someone verbally. And the Mishnah talks about one way of exploiting or oppressing someone verbally as having a sort of financial edge to it, or a sort of deceitful edge, let's say, to it, right? If you say something to someone, to say, a person says to a seller, how much are you selling the item for? Right, even though they have absolutely no intention of purchasing it. Or if we can translate it into some contemporary terms, you invite somebody to an event you're running when you know the person is not really going to be able to attend, right? So you give them the impression that you really wanted them to be your honored guests, when in fact you're really only inviting them because you know that anyway they're not going to be able to make it. Right, that's one form of ona'at dvarim, but the Mishnah goes on to say that another form of ona'at dvarim is bringing up a penitent's past misdeeds, or talking to a ger about the things his or her ancestors might have done. In other words, hurting a person by bringing up uncomfortable parts of their past. These are also forms of ona'at dvarim. And the Gemara, in discussing this Mishnah, says very famously that as you can see here, and perhaps I'll send out the source sheets and look at a little bit more closely, the Gemara very famously says, Gadol ona'at dvarim mi ona'at mamon, that in fact ona'at, oppressing somebody verbally, is in fact worse than oppressing them or exploiting them financially. If you recall back in the verses in Leviticus, the word, as I mentioned before, tonu, appears twice. The Gemara explains, the Midrash before the Gemara explains, that one of those mentions of tonu is a reference to financial exploitation, and one of them is in fact referring to verbal exploitation. And the second repetition of that word, the one that they attach to verbal exploitation, comes along with the phrase v'yareta me'elokecha, that you should fear your God, implying that in fact verbally wronging somebody is perhaps even worse than financially wronging them. This passage goes on to say, and with this I'll really conclude, Kol hamalbin pnei chavero berabim ki'ilu shofech damim. Very famously, anyone who humiliates another in public, it is though he were spilling blood. And so that's something that the Gemara kind of rounds out this discussion of ona'ah with, although our mishnayot are primarily interested in financial exploitation. The Mishnah does also underscore the fact that there are other ways to be exploitative that are perhaps even worse. Okay, and with that I'll conclude, and again wish all of you a Gmar Chatima Tova, and we will resume next week. This week, again, as we said, you're going to be learning the Mishnayot of chapter 5, and that's what we will discuss next week in our class.
Gmar Chatima Tova. Thank you.
Gmar Chatima Tova.
Gemar Chatima Tova. I hope to see as many of you as possible next week. And I would like to remind people that class registration for the fall semester is open. And this includes, well, we have a few more weeks of Bava Metzia. It also includes the sign up for Bava Basra starting in about 1 month in early November. Gemar Chatima Tova, Tzom Kal for those who
is
are
that
in the US. Yes, Bava Basra Mishnah in Depth Bava Basra will be on a different night. It will be in the evenings US time with Rabbi Nathaniel Helfgott.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.